Okay. Hello, everyone. How are you from Morocco? We are very glad to start one of the very interesting topics that will be shared with our special guest speaker. So the American TESOL Academy for International Education, in collaboration with EduFIS, is organizing a TESOL webinar on making thinking and learning visible, facilitated by our international trainer, Andrew. And the topic is making things and learning visible. So this is the abstract. Learning is a complex phenomenon that can be hard to assess, particularly when teachers simply assume what students can or cannot do. In order to really observe learning, we must make it visible. So in this online session, we will look at a few strategies to help students use thinking routines as well as show what they have learned through different types of media. Participants will be encouraged to take an empirical approach to language teaching and prioritize the collection of evidence from their learners so that they can better assess learning outcomes. This online session will explore some tips proposed by Harvard's Project Zero and John Hatch's Making Learning Visible. So our speaker, his name is Andrew Hedlund. Do I pronounce correctly, Mr. Andrew?
Yes, yeah, that's it. Well done.
Perfect.
Yeah.
He's achieving alumni MSS in Psychology of Education from the University of Bristol, an educational consultant, speaker, and guest lecturer on bilingualism and cognition in postgraduate courses. He's also a member of Brazil TESOL's Mind, Brain, and Education CIG, and academic director for EduFIS. He's the author of the All Factor, Reframing Your Teaching Philosophy, and he blogs at educationrocks.com. It's our great pleasure again to welcome our special guest speaker from Brazil. And Brazilian people breathe soccer, but Andrew will breathe knowledge of thinking. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lucy. That's a wonderful introduction. Yes, we breathe soccer, and now the World Cup is coming. So you can imagine how excited everyone in Brazil is. I have to be honest with you. I haven't been keeping up with soccer lately, but I'm a huge fan of the World Cup. I know every World Cup. I'm so excited, and I hope we do okay this time because we have lost some of our magic, I think. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I'm very happy to be here connecting with teachers from Morocco. I was just telling Lucine a couple of minutes before we started, streaming live, that I love your food. I'm a huge fan of tagine and couscous. To be honest, I think probably 10 years ago, when I was throwing theme parties to help people practice their English, I remember cooking a big pot of couscous and tagine for probably, I don't know, 15, 20 people, my friends and, students who wanted to practice their English. So it was a Moroccan night with your food, my favorite. So I'm looking forward to visiting your country, and who knows?
Very welcome.
Yes, I would love to taste the original tagine there. And today, as Lucine said, I will be talking about making thinking and learning visible, because I think this is probably one of the most relevant things we can learn about as teachers. How do we know if our students are actually learning what we are teaching them? So I'm going to challenge you a little bit. I will ask you some questions. You can interact with me via Lucine as well. And I just wanted to mention that this is part of a new partnership with EduFest. And EduFest is a very interesting organization if you want to know more about continuous professional development, we are creating a hub for teacher education. So we've just had a couple of weeks ago, I was in Trapani, Sicily, southern Italy, beautiful place, in a conference that we organized. And next year, we are organizing the conference in Athens, Greece. So, start planning, anticipate everything. Maybe you can go and meet some of us there. And I would like to thank my wonderful friend, Giovanni Rotura, who is, let's say, the mentor of all of this. And also, of course, American TESOL Academy for welcoming and embracing our projects and vision. So I hope we can work together for a very long time.
Our
I'm going
great
to
pleasure.
share. Thank you very much, Lucine. So I'm going to share my slides with you because I have lots of things to talk about. And basically, my slides are divided into three big parts. And we're going to talk about making learning and thinking visible, specifically learning, because this is a notion that comes from the research of John Hattie. And, John Hattie has had a lot of controversies, come his way in the last couple of years, with reason, because of his methodological problems, I would say. But the idea of making learning visible is quite interesting. Because how do you know if something is happening if you cannot see it or if you cannot feel it? How do you know if your students are learning if you can't find evidence to support that? And I start with a question for you, and I think a very important question, actually, which is covered here in the agenda. So I'm going to start with, what is an empirical approach to teaching? And visible thinking, what is that? 3 useful thinking routines, we're going to cover that. Then I'm going to give you some concrete examples. And approaching the end, I'm going to talk specifically about John Hattie's visible learning. And finally, some strategies for your teaching practice, right? Now, the big question that I said I was going to ask is this. I want to start with this one. Can learning be assessed? Because you are teachers, you have students, and then you teach them new contents, new skills every lesson. And then you have to assume, of course, that they are learning, they are making progress, they are going somewhere. But my big question here again is, but how can you assess that? How can you truly know if they are learning the things you're teaching them? So if you are here, and if you are a teacher, I assume that you agree with me that yes, learning, of course, can be assessed. And if you agree that learning can be assessed, then you must agree with 2 claims that I'm going to show you now. The first claim is, if learning can be assessed, there are certain outcomes that our students must achieve in their learning experience. If we cannot see those outcomes, then we don't know if they have learned or not. So that's a very important part of assessing learning. The second claim here is that these outcomes can be measured or ascertained based on certain criteria. I have to be able to, as a teacher, say that my students, they have made progress based on some criteria. If I cannot do that, I cannot measure learning. If I cannot measure learning, I don't know if they are learning well or not. I cannot help them learn more effectively. So these are 2 very important claims that are going to be fundamental for this session. If you are a teacher and you want to measure your students' learning, you have to look at their outcomes and you have to believe that learning can be measured. Otherwise, it doesn't work. But then, of course, that brings us to the idea of empirical approach or empiricism. And I will tell you a story right now. I don't know what's going on in Morocco at the time. I know that in some places in the world, we have many political debates, sometimes very, very complicated, I would say, political debates, people attacking each other because of their own ideas. And during those political debates, as we are having here in Brazil, many times people come and they say, well, in my experience, because I saw this happen, this is the best choice for the country now, because I saw it, I was there. This is my experience. And then the question I ask you that is this empirical evidence? I saw it, I was there, it's my experience. So I know this is good for the country. This is the best option. This is not empirical evidence. This is anecdotal evidence. And those are very different things, because anecdotal evidence is based on personal experiences. One person or a group of people, a small group, a family, for example, or a group of teachers or a school. Now, empirical evidence is something that is much more reliable, because it's not the experience of one single person or a small group, but it's the experience and the observations of entire populations, thousands of people or hundreds of people, sometimes even millions of people. So empirical approach means to favor an approach that gives you more reliability, that is more scientific or is more, let's say, trustworthy, okay? What do I mean by that? I mean that if you want to use an empirical approach to understand learning, you have to know about the scientific method, that you observe, you take notes, you collect data, you make hypotheses and all of that. And it's, like I said, it's evidence-based. You need to have evidence to support your claims. And it's also based on logical thinking, okay? Logical thinking. So it's not, I feel. If I ask any teacher right now in the world, are your students learning? Many will say, I feel that they are learning. Yes, I feel that they are learning. This is not empirical. I feel that they're learning is an emotion, or it's just an instinct that you might have. What is empirical? It's when you say, well, based on what I can see, what I can hear, what I can notice, what I can measure, yes, my students are learning, because I am collecting evidence to support my claims. And this is very important. And why is that important? Because you must ask yourself, what type of data or evidence can we collect from our students in the classroom to say whether they're learning or not? Because it's not simply a feeling. I taught something, I think they learned. You have to test if they have actually learned. You have to measure if they have actually learned, right? Now, this can be very complicated. It could be very scary, I would say, to a lot of teachers. How do I collect evidence? Well, this is what we're going to discuss today. There are ways, but if you want to see learning happening in front of your eyes, you have to make it visible, and you have to collect evidence to support your claims, right? Because Robert Bjork, who was, I think he still is, to be honest, professor of cognitive psychology at the University of California, I think, Los Angeles, so UCLA, he says that performance has to do with what can be observed and measured at the time of taking a test. But learning is what sticks with us. Yes. Now I have a big question again for you teachers. When you were teenagers or when you were at school, and maybe you were studying something like geography or history or, I don't know, physics, science, or anything like that, do you remember passing an exam, getting a very good grade, and not really knowing what you were talking about? Have you ever done that? Has that ever happened to you? You know, you were simply lucky to get an excellent grade, a mark for that test, for that exam. Has that ever happened to you? Quite probably. You know, I remember this happened to me. So I got excellent, sometimes I got excellent grades, but if you ask me if I knew how to explain those things, I didn't, you know. But the other way around is also possible. Sometimes I knew so much about the topic, I was very prepared, but because of the test, I got nervous or anxious, or maybe the test itself was not very well designed. And then my grades were terrible, even though I knew everything there was to know about this topic. So here we can basically claim that performance and learning are very different things. If you know something, you might perform well, but you also might perform poorly. And sometimes when you perform very well, it doesn't mean that you have learned, because learning should be everlasting. It's something that sticks with you. If you have learned English, you should be able to use English and talk in English and hear and listen to people talk in English and understand what they're saying. If you were able to get a 10 or an A on a test during, you know, your English course many years ago, but today you don't remember how to use that structure, you haven't learned, but you performed well at the time of the test, right? So that's why we have to be able to measure learning and not just performance. Tests, they're excellent for measuring performance, you know, what you can do at that time. How about learning? How can we measure learning if learning is there and if learning is going to stay with us? Well, that's a big question. And I think the sixth principle of mind-brain education can help us. Mind-brain education is this transdisciplinary area that involves neuroscience, psychology, and education. And it tells us that for you to learn something and memorize it, to make it memorable and stick forever, you need attention plus memory. Learning requires attention and memory because this is how the brain works. So basically, if you are not paying attention, you are not making new memories. If you're not making new memories, you are not learning. So we can see evidence that our students are indeed learning because we can look at their attention and we can look at their memory. And then we can not just apply a test, or we can check those things for a very long time and revisit them with a certain frequency. And this is how I basically now, this is exactly what I'm going to talk about. So I don't know if there are any comments or questions so far, but I can keep going, all right? And then of course, talk to Lucine and then he will tell me what you want to know, okay? Now think about it. Yeah, all good? Okay, let's keep going, right? Yes. So think about this. This is quite important, I would say. What is visible thinking? How does visible thinking happen? So visible thinking is what takes precedence over learning. Because, you know, think about this. For you to learn, you have to think first. If learning requires attention and memory, the only way for you to learn something and make it memorable in your brain is for you to first pay attention. And paying attention is a cognitive process, just like thinking. Thinking is about cognition, right? So one way for you to make sure that your students are learning is for you to see that they are thinking. If they are thinking about the tasks, the things that they must do, that means that they are probably going to learn more effectively. And how can you make their thinking more visible? Well, one thing you can do, and this comes from Project Zero by Harvard. And you know what? Project Zero by Harvard is quite old nowadays. It's been around for decades, okay? Which means that if you are not aware of this by now, you should be, because this is excellent and it's a very good guide to help you see or witness thinking taking place inside your students' brains, you know? And here are some examples of routines, visible thinking routines from Project Zero that can help you see thinking taking place. And I'm going to focus on a couple of visible thinking routines that you can use, and maybe you already use them, but for you to make sure that your students are engaging with the material, the tasks, the activities, the instructions you give them, so that they are paying attention. Because without attention, there is no memory. Without memory, there's no learning. So what are those visible thinking routines? You can start with the see, think, and wonder visible thinking routine, which is a great routine that you can use to introduce a new topic, for example. And I think we do that all the time. Go back to your English lesson, and you're going to introduce a new grammar topic, a new grammar structure, or maybe vocabulary. Maybe you're going to introduce something for basic learners. Maybe you're going to introduce clothes, different types of clothes, for example. And then you're going to show them a picture of somebody wearing something, a dress or a coat or a jacket, anything. And your students are going to see that image. They're going to think about what are the main characteristics of this image. And they're going to wonder, to try to think if they already know some of those items or if they don't know. So again, this is a very intuitive routine to help them think about the task. Because if you just tell them, look at the picture, do you know this? They might not be doing as they're told, because you cannot really see. So see, think, and wonder, or we have a very close version. It's think, pair, share. And I'm sure many of you use think, pair, share, right? I can see Lucine definitely uses that, right? Great. And what is think, pair, share? It's really, you look at something, you start thinking about it, get together with someone, and then tell them what you thought about, listen to them, and help them share and share your thoughts with them. This is incredibly useful. It's actually very effective, and it's a thinking routine as well. So we know, we can see right in front of us when students are interacting with their peers, exchanging information, so that means that they really, really looked at the image, they really thought about something, and they are really sharing. Because if we simply show a picture and ask questions, and we don't involve all the students, so no pair work, how do we know if that student in the back who is looking at us, yes, he or she, they are looking at us, but how do we know they are really thinking about that image that we are showing them? They might be thinking about their boyfriend or girlfriend, they might be thinking about dinner. They might be thinking about a party on the weekend. So there are many possibilities there. But when you use a visible thinking routine and you ask for evidence, you look at the evidence, then you can say, oh, they are really doing what they are supposed to do, which means that they are paying attention. The same thing for the next visible thinking routine. So this is an interesting routine because it's make a claim, identify support for your claim, ask a question about your claim. So it's the claim, support, question, visible thinking routine, right? So they can be used in different stages of the lesson, of course. Now, one of the things that we can do, and we should do more often, I think, is we should teach our students to use those visible thinking routines in a way that helps them structure their thinking process so that they can pay attention and they can learn more effectively, right? So let's imagine I want my students to tell me something that they have learned in this lesson. We are talking about a new grammar structure. Maybe we're talking about different past tenses. Let's say we've just introduced the past perfect tense, and they have to say, I had done something before something else happened. So the past perfect plus the simple past tense. It might be difficult for them. One of the things that I can do, I can ask them, so claim something, support your claim, and ask the question. And then they go like, okay, so the past perfect tense, this is the claim. The past perfect tense is used to indicate an action that happened before another action in the past. Yes, that's a good claim, right? It is, because it's a correct claim. And then I ask them, can you give support? Yes, and they can give me an example. They can say, before I came to my English lesson, I had taken a shower, or I had breakfast, or something like that. So yes, that makes sense. Now ask a question about your own claim. And then you can say, can I use the past perfect tense to narrate a novel or something like that, to write a book? And then, well, that's a very interesting question. Let's analyze. So this is a very interesting, very useful, visible thinking routine that your students can use to get them to structure their thinking and to get them to pay attention to what they're doing. The same thing for the next visible thinking routine. And I like this one very much because it goes like this. I used to think, now I think. I used to think, now I think. So this is great for, I don't know, maybe revising something as well, or at the end of the lesson to consolidate learning. So maybe they're learning, I used to think that this fruit was called this, but not this. And today, now I finally learned the right name for this fruit. So this is one way for them to reflect on their own learning process. And this is incredibly useful because, like I said, your students, they have to be more aware of their own learning process. And I think visible thinking routines, they can help do exactly that. We can help them become how can I say, the owners of their own learning process, let's say, so that they become self-sufficient and more autonomous, right? But we have more. Let me give you more concrete examples. The 3 routines that I used, you can use starting in your next lesson, basically, because they are practical. So in your next lesson, you can start with see, think, and wonder to introduce a new topic. Let's say you're going to talk about, I don't know, sustainability, okay? And you're going to introduce will for uncertain and distant futures. So you're going to talk about sustainable cities or something like that. And then you get a beautiful picture of a futuristic city, green city with green buildings, urban farms, farms on the top of the buildings and things like that. And you show that to your students and you ask them to see, think, and wonder. When they see, think, and wonder, they make notes. What do you see? I see a city, but is it a normal city? No, it's a futuristic city. Look at the design of the buildings, right? Look at the farms on top of the buildings. Look at the flying cars or something like that. So that's what they're thinking. And then they are wondering, will our cities be like this someday in the future? Can we get to that level? And that's how you introduce a new topic. And at that stage, pair share. So you thought, you structured your thoughts. Now pair, get together with a partner and share what you think about this picture. And then you will see your partners will have similar answers, some different answers. And this is a very rich exchange. And you can see it happening before your eyes. Now, for the next one, claim support question, you can do to practice, right? So let's go back to another concrete example. Let's imagine you're teaching your students how to use second conditional. So if I were, I would. If I were, I would, right? And then you have just introduced the topic, you have presented the topic, they read a text, and now they're going to do some activities. They're going to do something more controlled and then less controlled. And then they have sentences like this, and then in brackets, study more, and then in brackets, pass the exam. So basically, if I studied more, I would pass the exam. It's a hypothetical situation. You didn't study, but if you did study, so if you studied more, you would pass the exam. So you ask them to make a claim. So they might make a claim like this. The if clause, if sentence, is the one that comes with the simple past, right? Yes, that's a correct claim. If plus simple past in the second conditional structure. They might make a wrong claim. They might say if is the clause that comes with would. No, would comes after in a different clause, right? And then you might see how well they know this topic that they are learning. If they make a correct claim, if they can give support, give examples to support their claim, and ask intelligent questions, you can see that they are learning. It's visible. If they make incorrect claims, or if they make a claim but they cannot give support, or if they don't know how to ask a question about it, then you cannot see learning or thinking, in this case, taking place. And then finally, you can also think about this thinking routine. I used to think, now I think, to consolidate learning. And this is something that I normally use at the end of my lessons. And then I ask them like an exit ticket. I don't know if you use that in Morocco. So let's say before everybody leaves, they have to tell me something that they used to think and something that they think now. And it could be very short. So let's imagine I had a basic level, and instead of clothes, they were learning different vocabulary for vegetables. So, and then we had, in their book, we had pictures of vegetables and all of that. And they might think that zucchini, which is, a vegetable, it should be called courgette, which is a, a variation, let's say. So they used to think that Americans called courgette zucchini, or the other way around, zucchini courgette. But now I know that they call it zucchini. So it's just a small correction, something that they saw they were wrong about, but now they know the correct form, the correct word, the correct structure. So it's great to consolidate. Oh, so I have learned this today. Now I know, right? And then finally, of course, going back to the idea of visible learning. So what does visible thinking have to do with visible learning? And this is possibly the most important part. I mean, I always say that it's the most important part, right? But I think, of course, that visible learning, even though it's quite controversial because of John Hattie using studies that were not very well conducted, let's say, or he mixed a lot of things together. The idea of visible learning is very interesting. The idea of visible learning is perfect, I would say. Well, at least is very useful. Because, like I said at the beginning of this session, how can you see learning if you can't see learning? How do you know if learning is happening if it's not visible? How do you know that there is something there if you cannot see it? So visible learning is a very useful framework to help you see learning taking place. So visible learning comes from this research that I'm showing you now, John Hattie, the largest research in education according to most specialists. Like I said, a lot of the things there could be considered unreliable because of how he conducted the research, how which studies he selected. He selected 900, 1,000 meta-analysis. So he got studies from all over, especially Australia, because that's where he's from, about education, about schools, about things that make learning happen at schools. And then he put all of the data together and analyzed the effect size, right? So he pulled everything together and analyzed the effect size. And basically, the ones that have very large or very, effect sizes, they are extremely important for learning. So without those things, learning might not happen effectively. Those who have very small effect sizes, they are not so important for learning. They have an influence, but a distant, indirect influence. And in his list, his original list, the list that I used for my dissertation, he had 150 items, 150 items that have some sort of impact on learning. Most of them, as a matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, out of 150, 146 items had positive effect sizes. So that means that almost everything works for learning, So learning can happen. The problem is many of those things on the list, they had a very, very small impact on learning. So they're not worth pursuing, let's say. What happens here? I'm showing you a small list, of some of the things that he mentioned. So you will see, I'm going to focus on some just to give you some examples. But he says the most important thing is collective teacher efficacy. So if you have one excellent teacher at school, that's not good enough for learning. You need to have collective teacher efficacy. Your teachers, your teaching staff at school, if they are good, if they are efficacious, if they can perform well, they can teach well, your students are going to learn. So teachers are the most important variable for learning. We are the most important variable for learning. Without us, learning doesn't happen so effectively. But the second item on the list is student expectations. That's very important because sometimes your students believe that they cannot learn, or they believe that you teachers are using the wrong method because they heard something on the internet, because there are people promising revolutionary methods for them to learn faster, which are not true. So their expectations, they matter a lot for learning. And we have to help them adjust their expectations, and we have to meet their expectations as well. Also, he talks about student efficacy, because it's not just us teachers teaching our students, it's our students doing what they are supposed to do. That matters a lot. And sometimes we don't talk about this enough, especially nowadays. Families, they interfere with our practice a lot. They think that they should always ask us to help or to make their kids, their children learn. But then we have to tell them, I am doing my part. Are your children doing their part? Are they doing what they are supposed to do to learn? I can help them. But if they don't do those things, unfortunately, they're not going to learn very well. They have to be self-efficacious. And also feedback. One of the things we know from neuroscience is that the 4 pillars of learning are attention, engagement, feedback, and consolidation. Without attention, you cannot make memories. Without memories, you cannot learn. But if you are paying attention and you are making memories and you are learning things wrong, then because you don't have feedback, then it's very difficult to correct those things later, right? So we know that as students are learning, we should be able to give them as much feedback as possible. And we also know that teacher-student relationships are essential. And of course, we need to be professional, yes, but we also have to be friendly. We have to have good rapport with our students. Without good rapport, positive relationships, our students are not going to learn as effectively. And those are some of the items that I selected here that you can focus on. If you want to focus on those things, starting today or starting next week, so you can enjoy your weekend. Focus on those things: student expectation, student efficacy, feedback, teacher-students relationship. I'm going to give you some strategies now. So we talked about making thinking visible, using visible thinking routines, and I gave you 3 examples. So see, think, and wonder, claim, support, and question. I used to think, and now I think. Those are the visible thinking routines. For you to see the thinking process of your students taking place before your eyes. You can see that. It's tangible, right? That's important, because then you can say they are paying attention, they are engaged, they are making new memories, so they are probably learning. Now, how do you see the outcome? Because that's the process. Thinking is the process that gets you to learning. Now, how do you see the outcome of learning? How do you make it visible? Here are some strategies for you. And the first one is student expectation. So one of the things that we need to do every step of the way is share your goals with the students. This is proven. This is based on evidence. Sometimes we say, hello, students, and go open your books to page whatever. They don't know what they're going to learn. You don't share the goals with them. You don't share what you expect from them. And then they get basically either bored sometimes, or they're not interested anymore. So share the goals with your students. Also, as they are learning and you're teaching them new contents and skills, give them feedback. This is essential. And you can give feedback that is positive. I loved how you did this. This is great work. Well done. And you can give them feedback that is constructivist or critical, but in a non-threatening way. So this is interesting, but it needs improvement. I like what you did here, but here you need to change a couple of things. And I'm here to help. I'm here to give you support. It's not the type of feedback, this is horrible, do everything again, because this can cause some cognitive dissonance. They don't know what to do, they get overwhelmed, and this can affect your relationship with your students. And then finally, of course, emergent language. I wanted to share emergent language because this is a challenge for us, because emergent language is something we may not be prepared for, because it simply happens in the lesson. But many students, they are learning English not to learn the vocabulary and the grammar structures of the book, because the book follows a sequence, a scope and sequence, a syllabus. Many times, your students are learning English if they are grown-ups because of their profession. And your English books never talk about their profession. So this can be very deep or unmotivating, right? And if you are dealing with teenagers, pop culture, and they might like music and TV series and cinema and all of those things, and they would love to learn the words that go with their favorite, favorite stories, favorite books, anything, but you never teach them those things, never. So basically, you are killing their expectations. They would like to learn those things, but they never get the chance. They never have the opportunity. So embrace emergent language. And nowadays, we can, use Google to check, or translate or something like that. Even if it's something we don't know, we can always say, I don't know this. I know this might be difficult for many teachers to admit, but why don't you check for me and you bring the next lesson? Or this is a very interesting question. Let's focus on this today, but I'm going to write down here and bring that next lesson for us to discuss, okay? We must take their interests into consideration. Remember that. The next thing is student efficacy. So basically, your students, they should be self-efficacious. They should be able to set their own goals, to do the things you ask them without too much interference. If you have to constantly remind them all the time that they have to do this and that, they are not very self-efficacious. We can teach self-efficacy. There are ways we can do that. So please remind your students, ask them to be more self-efficacious. Then you can teach two concepts that are new concepts in the literature. They are growth mindset and metacognition. Growth mindset is becoming more and more controversial nowadays, but it's still a very useful concept, I would say. And it's the idea that if they have the right beliefs and attitudes, if they believe in commitment and effort, they can learn more effectively rather than if they just believe in talent or intelligence. So commitment is very important, but they also have to learn how to learn, and that's metacognition. How do you learn best? They have to learn new strategies, new skills, right? I am looking at the comments here, and so I don't know if I'm going to miss anybody, but I think Optimist said, could you give us more examples about sharing goals with students? That's a great question, because one of the things we do when we plan a lesson, normally we have, by the end of the lesson, the student should be able to, use this vocabulary effectively in this context, or use this grammar structure. This is something that we should share with our students, and I think make visible. So I have a blackboard here behind me, as you can see. So, if you're teaching and if you're using a blackboard, so you can write up on the corner, what are the objectives of that lesson? If you have an interactive whiteboard, you can share that. At the beginning of most books, when they introduce a new lesson, you can see the aims of the lesson, or we call them also intended learning outcomes. Share those things with your students, because this, according to research, can be very effective. I know there are other questions here, but I'm going back. I think interesting. Jalal, right? How can a teacher help students write a story when exposed to an image? In other words, in what way do teachers enable students to trigger their imaginative thoughts in order to write or tell a story based on an image? So that's a great question as well, Jalal. I think we have to stop sometimes underestimating our students' creativity and imagination. I think they can do those things better than us because they are younger than us normally. And one thing that I do that I think can trigger this process is I use very thought-provoking images. And I think I am writing a student's book at the moment. And it's based on the Sustainable Development Goals by the United Nations and all of that. And every unit opener, so basically you have a 2-page spread for every unit, the beginning of every unit, we try to use an impacting, something very thought-provoking image, so that students, they get so excited to talk and write a story about that. And I think we can do something similar. Another way, if you think your image is not very thought-provoking and you have to use that image, I think there are things you can do. You can hide parts of the image, and you can have a game, like a guessing game, So if you're going, I remember there was a lesson about Malala Yousafzai, and she was addressing the United Nations. And then there was a picture of Malala, and you could see that it was the United Nations, but somebody covered her face and covered parts of her body with little squares. And then the students, they cannot see who that is, but they get very intrigued. They are very curious, to guess. And you remove the obstacles little by little so that they can take their guesses. So this is a very good way to get them interested and use and talk about their own stories, And of course, going further here, and then I can go back to some of the questions, Oh, yes. So let me answer this now. I think it was Rabi who said, should students write the objectives in their copybooks or not? So that's a great question, Rabi, because I think they can certainly write the objectives if they have their books, their ELT materials that I'm sure you use. Sometimes they just have to highlight on the page of the book where the aims are so they can find those very easily. But they probably have a notebook as well. So I think it's interesting to make those notes, because when they are studying everything that they were exposed to, they can go back to their notes and then look at the objectives if they feel that they can do those things. So yes, I think it's and also it makes it visible for you. If you get their notebooks, sometimes we grade their notebooks and you can see that they are writing down the objectives in every lesson. It makes it visible to you. You can see that they are engaged with that, which means that they're probably learning more effectively. Now, how do you give feedback according to the research? You can basically follow the 3 steps that I mentioned here. Be clear, be honest, and be encouraging, So you have to be, because if you just destroy their self-esteem, it's not going to be effective, If you say, this is terrible work, but you can improve it. When you said the word terrible, you destroy their self-esteem. They're probably going to feel frustrated. Some of them are not even going to try again. So normally, think about the sandwich or the hamburger type of feedback, that you say something good, that's the bread, and then you say, and the meat is something that needs improvement, and then you end with something good again. It's a sandwich, So start with the bread, and then go to the stuffing, and then you go to the bread again. So you say, this is very interesting. I like the design. I love the colors. But here, the content of this slide is not very clear. So how can you improve? I think you can change this and that. But I also liked very much how you presented this. So this is the type of feedback that works really well, because you boost their self-confidence, their self-esteem. You give them the information that they need to make change. And then finally, you end with a positive note, let's say. So it's encouraging. If I don't know where I'm going or where I am, I know nothing. Remember this. This is a very important sentence, because if your students don't know where they're going, you can't measure their learning. They can't see progress. They cannot make their own learning visible to themselves, So that's why you have to show the direction, but make sure that they're getting there and making progress and recording this progress, registering the progress somewhere so that they can see their learning curves, Yes, Jalal asked, what do you mean by growth mindset? So growth mindset is a concept that comes from the research of Carol Dweck, and she published many papers in a book, Growth Mindset, the Psychology of Success. It's becoming more controversial nowadays because of interventions done in schools that are not working always. But the idea is that you believe that your intelligence is not limited, that your intelligence is not fixed. You believe that with effort and commitment, you can improve your intelligence and you can learn more. A lot of students believe that this is what I can do, mister. This is my limit. This is where I stop. And then having a more growth mindset, of course, sometimes we go back to the fixed mindset, sometimes we go back to the growth mindset, is believing that you can improve by being more committed, by analyzing what you're doing, and by applying the right effort. That's the idea. So people with a more growth mindset, they're usually more successful in life. I think Marwan, is this live going to be recorded and share? I think so, right, Lucy? Yes, it's being recorded. Don't worry. Great. And then, of course, we have teacher, student relationship. And, be friendly with your students. You don't have to be their friends, even though you should and you can be their friends, but be friendly. Establish rapport with them, because if they look up to you, they admire you, they are going to want to learn from you. A lot of teachers tell me, oh, icebreakers and telling students things about my personal life, that's a waste of time. It's not professional, because I should be teaching them English. Yes, of course you should be teaching them English. But if they don't like you, if they don't respect you, if they don't admire you, if they don't know you as a human being, they are not paying attention. They don't care so much about what you have to teach them. So you're not wasting time bonding with your students. You're not being unprofessional. You are helping them learn more effectively. My mom and my dad always told me, if I want people to listen to me, first they have to like me or respect me. So hopefully, if you are listening to me now, that means you like me or you respect me, you admire me. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to do here, because otherwise none of this matters, because you're not going to pay attention, it's not going to be appealing, and you're not going to learn, right? Yes. And then, of course, going to the next slide, I can tell you this. So we're approaching the end, and then we can take some questions. How can we make learning visible? We can make learning visible through assessment. How? I'll give you three ways. Assessment of performance, not the best way, because it's about the time of taking the test, but assessment of performance, what you can remember that day based on what I gave you. So if I taught you for 5 weeks before your test, and you take the test, that will show me your performance. That will show me what you were able to remember based on the contents that I shared with you, the skills that I shared with you. That's your performance. Your performance is not always the best indicator of your learning, but it's one indicator of your learning. Now, a better way to make learning visible is through assessment of learning. Assessment of learning is what you can remember when you are free to think. It's not about what I gave you. If I gave you a multiple choice test, you can simply, tick the right answers. And what if I ask you 5 weeks in, what do you know today? What have you learned from this course from me? And then I listen to you freely, talking freely. One way you can do that, and we don't do that normally, at the end of your test, so you have a written test for your students, and sometimes you have a gap fill activity, a true or false. Maybe they have something complete with the correct grammar structure. So it's normally those things, right? But at the end of your test, you can add one question. Remember this question for the rest of your lives. At the end of your test, you add this question to assess learning. Is there anything that you know that I didn't ask and you would like to share? See, is there anything that you know that I didn't ask? That's the best way to assess learning, right? So they are going to, maybe they studied very hard and you didn't ask that question on the test, but at the end, you give them the chance to show what they have learned. And then finally, of course, assessment for learning. And assessment for learning is an amazing tool, because assessment for learning is when your assessment becomes a tool to help them learn throughout the way. And this is incredible, because it's basically continuous formative process to steer your learning. I assess what my students are able to do so that I can change and adjust how I'm teaching them and all of those things. And then to wrap up, I can share with you, and then of course you can ask questions, I can share with you the different types of assessment that you can do. So this is one of the papers. It's an article that I wrote with my colleague, Houston, and we talk about evidence-based strategies to help your students learn more effectively. And the best type of assessment is the assessment that you simply ask them to share what they have learned instead of structuring too much, you know. It's called retrieval practice. So basically, at the end of your learning unit or every lesson, actually more than once every lesson, give your students the opportunity to share what they have learned so far. What do you remember about today's lesson so far? Share. Create flashcards. Tell a friend. Write in your notebook instead of giving them a more structured test or something like that. That's a very interesting type of assessment. Now, 2 stories to wrap up. And those stories, they come from basically a book and my own experience. So there's a book by Mitchell Resnick called Lifelong Kindergarten. And lifelong kindergarten means that one of the best teaching and learning experiences in the world is the kindergarten. Think about it. So when you were kids, you were able to explore the environment, learn with the environment, and you produced portfolios. You know, the things that you did, they were recorded, they were part of a folder or drawings or something. So you produced portfolios. When we become literate, we learn how to read and write, we forget about those things. We focus much more on reading and writing. But we can learn through different ways. We can learn by drawing, we can learn by expressing ourselves through songs, dance, you know, different types of artistic endeavors, because we are human beings. And we've been doing that for thousands of years, you know. And one of the things that we removed from the educational system for teenagers and adults is the idea of free exploration, kindergarten, you know. And that's very interesting. I think we can bring that back to education somehow. There should be some time during your lesson allocated for free practice, exploration, and exchange of things, and creating portfolios. And the other story, my students, and they are university students, I am teaching them bilingual education. And I told them, I want you to think about the ideal bilingual school. What does the ideal bilingual school look like? So you have to create something to show that bilingual school to me, the ideal. And then they said, do we have to write something about it? I said, no, you will show me something. I don't care about the format. You choose the format. I don't want to limit your creativity. And I was right, because they sent me these things. Take a look. Some of them decided to make an infographic on Canva about how their school, their ideal bilingual school, is based on emotional intelligence. It was beautiful. It's a beautiful, perfect design. Other students, they created Manage Your Emotions, Achieve Your Goals podcast. So they got together. One of them was the host. The other ones were interviewees, and they were talking about their ideal bilingual school. And those were excellent as well. But the one that really impressed me is this 3D model of a school that they built inside a video game. So basically, they built a virtual model of the school that they wanted, they envisioned for their children, for their students, inside the video game. The Sims was the video game. And not only was I able to walk virtually through the school, the halls of the school, but I could see every corner, every room, what was going to happen in those rooms. And if I had limited, you know, this task to write about the ideal school, I would have never seen things like this. So remember this. Go back to kindergarten a little bit and allow your students to use different formats to show that they're learning, because it's make learning visible. show something so that I can see that you have learned what I've been teaching. And that's it, everybody. So thank you very much. I'm ready for questions. If you, I can see many comments here. I don't know, so we can go back. But thank you very much. This is all I have to say. Should I go back to, I think I have, you have to unmute yourself, Lucine.
Yes, thank you, our special guest speaker, Andre, coming from, he's now in Brazil and sharing his knowledge and expertise with our Moroccan audience. Is the topic was very nice. It's about, thinking, learning, and make them visible for our learners. Yeah, there were a couple of questions that you answered, and very interesting comments. They really enjoyed the topic. And there's another question that I would like to share with you. It's from, it's a
Please,
youth
yes.
question. Does visual learning work with primary school students?
That's a great question as well. When you say visual learning, don't think about learners as visual, kinesthetic, or auditory, because it's not like this, to be honest. Based on neuroscience, we know that every one of us, we have all the styles, and it's better if we use the different styles to teach, so we can give input in different ways. So we can show an image, you can play a listening, you can create a 3D model and all of that. But definitely, I think one of the things we can do for primary learners and secondary learners, I think for all learners, but especially for primary learners, young learners, is to make the things that they are creating visible to them. So we can say, graphic organizers or visual organizers of their production. So that can become part of a portfolio. And I base my comments here on two amazing educators from Italy. The first was Loris Malaguzzi, who established a school in the region that we know as Reggio Emilia, which it's close to Bologna in the north of Italy, right? And he said, basically he said that kids, they have 100 languages to express themselves. So if you limit what they can do to one language, then you're missing on such an amazing opportunity to see those children flourish, that become what they are, the potential, fulfill their potential. And the other amazing Italian educator was Maria Montessori, the Montessorian schools, and basically both educators, they worked with the idea of pedagogical documentation and portfolios. So it's making what your students are doing visible. If it's a drawing, get it, put it in a folder. If you want, make it a digital portfolio, take pictures of their work and put it on a cloud or on Padlet, on Jamboard, I don't know. Because yes, visual organizers, graphic organizers, they're excellent for you to see the progress your students are making and for them to see the progress that they are making. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's nice. Yes, there is another, comment by Hanan Shamal. By the way, Hanan Shamal is a trainer. Is a teacher trainer in Morocco. She said that we can make, thinking and learning visible also by gamification or using games.
Yes, definitely. Yes, I think that's a great observation, most certainly. Because when we play a game, and this is very true, we are very engaged, I think, because there's a clear goal. We want to, win. We also want to cooperate with our peers to achieve the goal. And so it's self-engaging, let's say. It's something that we don't need to do much, and our students, they love those things. But I'm telling you this because my professor, Paul Howard-Jones from the University of Bristol, he's an expert in neuroeducation, so neuroscience and education, and he studied the impact of gamification on learning. And nowadays we have a lot of evidence to support that when you play a game to learn something, it's much more effective than if you are exposed to something in a different way. And I was one of the subjects of his experiments at the university. For example, he got some students to do number games on a computer. So there were number games. So basically, there was a list of numbers and the non-gamified way. So you just had a list of numbers and nothing, and you had 10 minutes or so to memorize the numbers. Then you had to wait for a couple of minutes, and then the interviewer asked you, how many numbers can you remember? How many digits can you remember? And then take notes. The other was the gamified condition. We had 10 minutes to play a game with all of those numbers. And the game, so there were 3 numbers on top, and then there was a ball, and we had to catch the ball and hit the number. It was much more fun. We paid a lot more attention, and guess what? The second condition, the gamified condition, was the best condition for us to learn. We remembered many more numbers because of that. So we have evidence to support that gamification is excellent for learning. So by all means, use it to make it visible.
Thank you. Thank you so much, our special guest speaker, Andre. So on behalf of the American TESOL Academy, I would like to congratulate you for this very insightful presentation. And we would like to thank EduFest for the very active and productive, partnership. And inshallah, in the future, don't forget that American TESOL Academy will organize webinars from time to time, and we hope that Andre next time will be in, face to face, not online. And inshallah, as I told
inshallah,
you,
yes.
Thank you. We organize Rabat International Conference. It will be the 4th version. So we would love to have you with us, inshallah.
Wonderful. Inshallah. And thank you very much again, Lucine, and all of you who watched me. It was a pleasure. Enjoy your weekend, okay?
Thank you. Thank you. So kind of you. So
bye
see
bye,
you
everybody.
next time. Bye, everyone.
See you. See you.